Hello, and welcome to episode 2 of Sorastro's Blood Rage painting series. In this episode, we're going to paint the fire giant from Cool Mini or Not's Blood Rage. As usual, I'll be basing my colour choices on the wonderful artwork by Adrian Smith. This means matching quite an ambiguous skin tone of purples and blues, as well as rendering glowing runes, lava and flame. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge and thank the amazing Ben Comets and Vince Venturella for the tips I picked up recently from their work concerning the painting of fire and lava respectively. Let's take a look at the painting stages, and don't forget you can find links to the individual substages in the video description below. We'll prepare the miniature by creating a volcanic base of lava and rock before priming the model in black, followed with some zenithal highlights. We're then going to provide some dry brushing for the rocks and base colours for all the main areas of the figure, except for the fire and lava, which we'll save till later. Next, we'll work section by section, providing highlights and shade as necessary. We'll then finish the miniature off by painting all of the fire and lava effects, which will include having some fun with some object source lighting. Let's begin. After cleaning the miniature and removing any mould lines, I'm going to create a volcanic scenic base for the giant, and I'll once again be using Vallejo's basing products to do this. I'm going to need a rough texture to represent black rock, and a smoother texture to represent flowing lava. For the rocky parts, I've chosen to use Vallejo's black lava, which I've chosen because of its gritty texture, but any rough textured paste, such as brown earth, will be fine. It doesn't have to be black, since we'll be priming it anyway. For the flowing lava, I'm using Vallejo's water texture because it has a nice smooth texture, although something like the white stone we used in episode 1 would also be fine. I'm now going to apply the black lava using an old brush and a sculpting tool, and I'm going to be fixing some small pieces of cork to build up the rocky texture. I'm going to first sketch out where I want my lava to flow. I'm now going to carefully apply the paste to the base with an old brush. I'm then going to build the texture up with additional paste and pieces of cork. I like the idea of the giant leaning forward on a rock, so I'm wedging one in underneath his left fist. We then need to leave the giant for several hours to allow the paste to dry completely. At this point, you could of course add additional paste to build up certain areas further if you wish. You could now actually treat the exposed base as the lava, in which case you're ready to move on to the priming. Because I'd like my lava to have a sense of volume and flow, I'm going to apply some of Vallejo's water texture. When it's wet, this looks like a white gelatinous paste, and we can apply and spread it into the channels with a brush or sculpting tool. I'm smoothing this over as far as I can, but it doesn't have to be completely flat. With that done, I'm going to leave the water texture for 24 hours to dry completely before moving on to the priming. I'm now priming the miniature in exactly the same way I did the frost giant in episode 1, using Vallejo's black surface primer. Strictly speaking, this should also be left for 24 hours to fully cure. I'm then following this with some zenithal highlights using cold grey at a roughly 45-degree angle, followed with some dead white, which I'm spraying from above. I'm deliberately making the top surface of the right arm quite light to help give the impression of light being given off from the flaming sword. I'm also going to spray the lava and the blade of the sword with the white. Alternatively, this can of course be done with a normal brush later on instead. With the zenithal highlights applied, we're ready to begin painting. I'm going to begin by painting the volcanic rocks with some black, which I've thinned with a few drops of water. The reason I've started with the rocks is so that I can give them a dry brush in a moment without worrying too much about hitting the giant. A single layer of this should be fine. Once dry, I'm going to dry brush the rocks using Vallejo's Cold Grey. I'm using a size 3 Series 56 flat brush by Rosemary & Co for this. I'm wiping most of the paint off on some paper before repeatedly flicking the brush across the surface of the rocks, aiming to catch most of the raised edges. I'm then going to apply a dry brush using Scrag Brown to suggest a more reddish light being given off from the lava. I want to focus this more heavily on the rocks that are closest to the lava flow, and I'm trying to be a little more directional with my brush strokes as I do this. I'm going to reinforce this effect by brushing a thin layer of the Scrag Brown around the very edge where the rock meets the lava. This will also provide a more effective undershade for any of the red that might end up here later on when we paint the lava itself. I'm now going to apply some Nuln Oil to darken the more shaded parts of the rocks and tone down any overdone highlights. I'm hitting the places that don't look as if they would receive much light from the lava. To really maximise the depth, I'm also going to apply some black ink by Scale Colour to the darkest recesses. This has quite a glossy finish, which somewhat counterintuitively helps give the impression of an even deeper tone. Finally, for now, I'm going to clean up the lava with a fresh white base coat. We want this to be as bright as possible, so may need to apply 2 or more layers. We'll add some colour to the lava later on, just in case we drop any paint on it whilst we're working on the giant. Now we're going to paint on the base colours for the rest of the model, and I'm starting with the skin. I'm going to use a 2-to-1 mix of Thunderhawk Blue and Rhinox Hide. I'm using a size 3 brush to measure out 3 brushes of the Thunderhawk Blue and 1.5 of the Rhinox Hide. Because I'd like to take advantage of the zenithal highlights, I'm going to thin this with around 3 brushes of water and 3 or 4 drops of Vallejo's Glaze Medium. I'm then applying a single layer of this to the skin. The colour this produces is a rather vague murky grey colour, but it will serve as a neutral pivoting tone from which we'll be introducing some more purplish shadows and some cooler, more bluish highlights in a while. I'm spreading the paint out over as much of the surface as I can, and we can see that the zenithal highlights are still quite present. I'm also painting the inside of the mouth with this. Next, I'm going to paint the hair with a single layer of dryad bark. I'm taking care to avoid the metal adornments whilst I do this. For the metal areas, I'm going to use an equal mix of Retributor armour and Flashgitz yellow, lightened with a little white. I'm going to apply 2 layers of this to achieve a bright, solid finish. I'm now going to paint the loincloth once again using dryad bark. And I almost forgot to paint the sword handle with the metallic yellow. For the skulls, I'm using Vallejo's Blue-Grey Pale. Finally, I'm going to use some Zandri dust for the teeth and the tusks. We're now ready to add some highlights and shade. I'm going to start by adding some depth to the skin tone using a 3:2 mix of Naggaroth Night and Caliban Green. I'm brushing this into all of the shadowed areas. I will often then quickly rinse the brush and use it to gently feather the edges of the shadow. All we're really doing is exaggerating the shadows that are nicely marked out for us by the zenithal highlights we added earlier. I really want to maximise the depth in the shadows of the right arm in particular, in order to help the object source lighting we'll be adding later stand out. I'm not being shy about blocking in large areas of shadow for places like the left leg. We'll be adding even more depth here in a while. Now I'm going to add some highlights using the original skin tone mix of Thunderhawk Blue and Rhinox Hide, but in a 4:1 ratio. I'm then going to lighten this with the addition of Vallejo's Pale Blue in a couple of stages. We want this tone to match or be just a shade lighter than the current level of the highlights already present on the model. Some of these highlights can be applied with the grain of the skin texture, like you can see here. This cooler blue tone will contrast nicely with the warmer, fiery tones we'll be introducing later on, making them appear hotter by comparison. I'm now going to return to deepen the shadows further using a roughly 3:2 mix of Nuln Oil and Druchii Violet, which I'm thinning with 3 parts of medium. I'm spreading this up into the mid-tone to gently boost the level of purple in the shadows and smooth the transitions. To really maximise the depth, I'm going to apply a 2:1 mix of Scale Colours Black and Violet inks into the deepest shadows. These inks can also be thinned and feathered just like a regular shade. We'll be injecting more life into the skin tone later on with some hot object source lighting. Now let's move on to the armour. I'm now going to shade the golden armour and sword handle using Agrax Earthshade, to which I'm adding a little optional Celia green shade in a roughly 4:1 ratio. To bring further depth and definition to select areas, I'm also going to brush in an equal mix of non-oil and Druckii Violet. Our options when deciding if or how to highlight the armour include simply leaving it as it is, or applying a simple light metallic dry brush. Both of these options would be fine for a good tabletop standard. I'm going to go a little further and manually paint on some highlights, starting with a 2-to-1 mix of Auric Armour Gold and Tzimisce Desert. I'm simply highlighting most of the obvious raised edges and surfaces with this. I'm then going to lighten this with the addition of some white in a few stages. I'm now starting to create semi-random hotspots of light, that is, areas where the metal happens to be catching the most light. I'm doing this somewhat intuitively, and your own reflections may look quite different. We can build these highlights up quite steeply, ending with a few small glints of pure white. Once I'm happy with the armour, I'm going to move on to the loincloth, and I'm going to paint the metal studs with some Leadbelcher. I'm then going to shade both the loincloth and the hair with some neat Nuln Oil. I'm also going to thin some Nuln Oil with an equal measure of medium and use this to shade the skulls. We can now highlight the hair and the loincloth with the original Dryad bark, which I'm lightening by mixing in some Screaming Skull in a couple of stages. To highlight the skulls, I'm going to mix some Carrick Stone with the original blue-grey pale. We needn't worry about avoiding the eye sockets, since we'll be giving them a fiery glow later on. Next, I'm going to paint the nails with some Zandri dust. We can then highlight the nails as well as the teeth and the ends of the tusks with some Screaming Skull. I'm going to finish the teeth and tusks off with a small touch of ivory, or you could simply add white to the Screaming Skull. Finally, I'm going to darken the roots of the tusks with some thinned Dryad bark. Now that we've achieved effective shadows and highlights for the main areas of the giant, we're ready to add the fire effects. I'm now going to paint the lava, and we'll begin by applying a single layer of Uriel Yellow. What's important is the order in which I'm applying the colours. Placing the yellow down first over the white gives the lava its brightest expression. I'm now going to jump to the darkest tone, Vallejo's Gory Red, and place a strip along the border of the lava stream. I'm then going to roughly feather this out with a damp brush. It's okay for this to hit some of the surrounding rocks, and our blending doesn't have to be especially smooth. This may appear a little over red, but we'll compensate for that in a moment. To finish the lava off, I'm now going to apply a thin layer of orange fire. This can cover most of the lava, but you might want to leave some of the central hotspots more of a brighter yellow colour. Notice how this tones down the red and helps it to blend with the original yellow. A second thin layer of this can be applied to your liking. For a more textured look, you could also paint on some darker cooled spots on top if you like. Once we're happy with the lava, we're going to move on to the sword, and I'm going to begin by laying down a clean white base tone. I'm now going to apply 2 thin layers of Uriel yellow. Next, in a separate well, I'm going to mix some flat red into the Uriel yellow to create an intermediate orange. Because we're going to do some wet blending, we want to keep some of the pure yellow and pure red handy. Here you can see I've got my yellow, orange and red ready to go. I'm now going to use the orange to colour the upper portion of the sword. I'm then quickly taking some of the yellow and roughly blending it with the orange on the sword. If you've never tried wet blending before, then this is the perfect opportunity, since fire is not a strict form. To add interest, I'm also going to introduce some of the orange to the base of the sword. It helps if the paint isn't too thin when working like this, and there's nothing wrong with mixing in a little retarder to give yourself more time to work with the paint before it starts to dry. This is also the reason I'm painting one side of the sword at a time. We can then apply a small amount of the pure flat red to the very tips of the flames. I'm then going to use the orange to wet blend this in. We can freely add additional yellow or orange to achieve a look we're happy with. Once that's completely dry, I'm going to thin some Uriel yellow right down with some water and wash this over the entire sword. What we want to see here is the yellow collecting in the gaps and recesses where the flame would be at its hottest. I'm then going to mix some white with the yellow and paint this into the runes, which I want to appear white hot. I'm going to increase the amount of white in a couple of stages the closer I get to the centre of the blade, which I want to appear hottest. I'm also going to lighten the groove with this. And we can also brighten some of the small recesses on the flames. I'm using a small amount of pure white for the hottest runes in the centre of the blade. I'm also adding some small spots to the flame tips with this. I'm going to finish the flaming sword off by brushing on a little Agrax Earthshade to give a smoky finish to the tips of the flames. And this completes the sword. The next Vari element I'm going to paint are the glowing runes on the giant's body. To do this, I'm going to first apply an optional glow to the area surrounding the runes, using a roughly 2:1 mix of orange fire and flat red. We're going to draw a narrow border around the edge of the runes, and it's okay for this to hit the runes themselves in the process. If possible, you may also want to feather the edge out to create a more realistic diffusion of the glow. We're then going to trace the runes themselves with some pure white. We'll then take some orange fire, which we're going to thin down considerably, and brush it over the runes. This will also do a nice job of lightening up the surrounding glow. Once the first application is dry, we can drop in additional spots to create some variation. I'm now going to use the pure white to paint the eyes on the skulls, as well as the giant himself. And for the skulls, I'm once again going to simply spread the orange glaze on top. We're now going to have some fun with some object source lighting, sometimes called OSL for short, which just means recreating the effect of light being given off from objects other than the generic lights in a room or the sun. I'm going to begin by using some pure flat red to simulate the effect of glowing red light being given off by the volcanic ground. This is just like adding highlights, except the light is coming from below rather than above. There are a few things to be aware of when doing this. Firstly, the red will appear quite a bit brighter when it's wet than when it's dry. We're also fighting against the fact that we're painting over a near black base colour, and these are also areas that won't be receiving much natural room light. All of this means we can afford to be fairly bold when we place our highlights. That being said, there's nothing wrong with playing it safe and applying some thin layers to begin with. We can push the intensity of the highlights by adding additional layers. And where the light spreads over a larger curved surface like the arm here, we can feather it out to create a more diffuse falling off of the light. Physics would dictate that we ought to reduce the intensity of the light the further away we get from the source, but I would still like to take them all the way up to the face for dramatic effect. I'll be adding some of this environmental lighting to the armour in a moment, but first I'd like to create the effect of light being given off from the sword. I would like a more orangey light for this, but to achieve that we'll have to first lay down a thin layer of red. This won't look great at this stage and requires one of those small leaps of faith to trust that it will look fine in a moment. I'm going to feather this out as we get to the upper end of the arm, which is furthest from the sword. I'm keeping this quite thin so as not to over-darken the area. All we're doing is providing a more effective undertone for the orange that I'll be applying next. I can also imagine some of this light hitting some of the other surrounding areas, although it would be a little less intense, so I'm thinning the paint down accordingly. Once we're happy with the placement and intensity of the red, we can lay our orange glaze on top. Just as we did with the red, I'm spreading the paint more thinly the further away from the sword we get. Here, I'm gently pushing the intensity of the orange the closer we get to the burning blade. I'm now applying some fairly concentrated orange highlights to the handle of the sword. And I'm doing the same to the nearby metalwork. I'm also now going to apply some of the red lava light to the armour. A few other finishing touches might include adding a few spots of thinned white to bring a little extra glow to the runes. And I'm using some skin tone to make the glow slightly more diffuse where it looks a little heavy. I would also now like to give the impression of light being given off by the eyes. To do that, I'm going to use some thinned white to carefully illuminate the surrounding area. We can then glaze some of the orange fire on top. And now I'm applying some red. I've also chosen to boost the intensity of the lava glow by mixing some of the orange fire into the red. After tidying up the rim of the base with some black, I'm going to protect the miniature with an application of matte varnish. And my final touch will be to add some thinned gloss varnish to the mouth and teeth. And this completes the Fire Giant. Thank you for watching. I hope you have enjoyed the video. To keep up to date with what I'm working on each month, you can catch my monthly schedule on Twitter and Facebook, which you can find links to in the video description below. My very special thanks go to the kind patrons who are funding these tutorials. Covering ambitious miniatures like this takes many hours that I couldn't otherwise justify spending without the support of my viewers. Join me again soon as we continue painting miniatures from Blood Rage. Happy painting!